Okay, good morning, everyone. So, welcome to week 6 of this 10-week course. Today, I'm really excited to talk about extracting honey and things you need to consider when selling and bottling honey here in the state of Texas. And so, before we begin, I just want to kind of clarify the colony tags. These are basically just tags that have sort of a colony ID number, a beekeeper ID number that come in these kind of small, kind of white tags that you basically staple to the side of the colony. After this, I'll kind of talk to you about our inspection reports that it's entirely optional by the beekeepers. So if you want to do your own inspections and submit your information to us so we can provide you a report and some management recommendations, you're more than willing to do that. But regardless, these takes are free. We can print pretty much anything on the take. So if you have a specific name or a company name or something you want to put on that take, we're happy to print that for you. So I sent a link, I think last week, but I'll send it again probably today or tomorrow just so you have that information. And also, we are developing a brand new Textmaster beekeeping logo. And so we have a few mock-ups and we're going through the board to figure out which would be like the best. But I'd love to open up to all the beekeepers and get kind of your feedback and your voting on it. We've had the old logo for about 10 years, but the problem is printing that logo on any apparel, any type of you know, desk cover. And so we definitely need to develop a brand new logo. And so I'd love to kind of send it out to you guys and get kind of a poll on what you guys are thinking and which one sort of works best for the program. So today I'll talk about extracting honey. And so I know it's kind of early to talk about extracting honey. Maybe some of you are extracting honey coming out of the winter, but most of you are probably going to start extracting probably July or August. But I do want to cover it a little bit. And so this first section we'll talk about just processes for extracting honey, not only for a small scale beekeeper, but also how beekeepers on a larger scale that have thousands and thousands of colonies extract honey. And the second part of the talk, we'll talk about selling and bottling honey in Texas. I guess when I first got the position, I got so many questions about what other regulations do you need to be certified and things you need to consider about selling honey in the state of Texas. And so we'll cover a lot more about that in depth in the second part of the section. So extracting honey, right? When you think about extracting honey, the first part is removing any honey supers. So, I'm originally from the Midwest, and so our colonies produce, thousands and thousands of pounds that can be in multiple deep supers. Here in Texas, it's a little bit less, kind of depending on your region. And so some beekeepers may be pulling, one or three to four honey supers. But thinking about how to pull your honey supers is probably the first step when thinking about extracting. So there's really three major ways to pull your honey. We sort of have the fume board method. This is where beekeepers are using specific chemicals to push the bees down to the brood boxes. And so when you're extracting honey, the one thing you want to consider is how to remove the bees from the supers so you can pull that honey without having any bees or brood within that honey super. And so one of the major reasons, one of the major methods is by using a fume board. And so fume board, we use specific chemicals. Those chemicals produce a fume in the heat, and that pushes the bees back down into the brood boxes. And so when you're pulling out the honey supers, you have to worry about having any bees within that honey super. I should have these I have these background backwards for some reason, but this is a skateboard method. Maybe some of you use skateboards in the past. I've used it a few times when I was in the Midwest. Basically, what it does is bees are only able to move one way, but they can't move back. And so this specific skateboard has these conical tubes. And so the bees are able to kind of move outside the conical tube, but able to move back. And so what you do is you typically put this between the brood boxes and the honey supers overnight. And when the night temperatures are really low, the bees move down to the brood boxes to take care of the brood and young developing bees. But when the temperature is warm, the bees are unable to move back into those honey supers. And so you put these on for maybe 24 hours or 48 hours, depending on the nighttime temperatures. That pushes all the bees down to the brood boxes. And so you can come back the next day or the day after that to pull any honey supers off. Another method that I've used before is the blower method. And so you can use any type of blower. This is sort of an industrial blower you can use. But I know a lot of beekeepers use leaf blowers. So essentially what you do is you pull out the honey supers and you kind of move the frames around and use this blower to blow off all the bees to the front entrance. This can be really quick method, but can be kind of messy too. And so For me, I typically prefer the fume method. But if you do decide to use a blower or a skateboard, those are all valid methods. So fume board, this is sort of what a fume board looks like. Go back. This is what a fume board looks like. Typically, it has kind of a it basically kind of has like this kind of black sheet on top. So it can be some sort of plastic. It can also be kind of a black corrugated board, something that kind of absorbs heat and produces that fume. But oftentimes I'll have this kind of top part, and the middle part will be a cloth. And so on that cloth, you basically spray that chemical, and that chemical produces a fume in the heat and pushes the bees down. So in North Dakota, we use this a lot. Oftentimes, we'd actually put a PVC pipe on it because we had a lot of wind in the Dakotas. So 50 to 60 mile per hour wind wasn't abnormal. And so this wind could actually also push the fume down into the colony. But really here in Texas, the wind doesn't get too egregious. And so using just a typical fume board works. And actually, I've started noticing a lot of bee supply stores start selling these fume boards. These are, I mean, also really easy to make. I typically use this kind of a shallow box and kind of modify that into a fume board. So that really works. You can make your own with kind of 1x2. So it's really easy to make. But otherwise you can buy these at any type of bee supply store now, which I think is really great. So it is a fume board is kind of cloth covered panel, and you basically put some kind of bee repellent into that cloth, and that bee repellent gets fumigated in the warm weather, in the sunny weather, and that fumes really push the bees down. Now, the most commonly used is called BeeGo, also called Bee Robber. There's different names for it. It's really harsh. If you ever used it before, it sticks everywhere, and you'll smell for days and days afterwards. And also, if you use too much, it can get into your eyes when you're sweating, and that can really start burning your eyes. It doesn't cause any damage, but it can be kind of painful. So I like BeeGo because it works really well, but there's parts of it I don't like because of the smell, and it's really hard to get off any clothes, and so it's just one of those methods. There's other new products like Honey Bandit. There's a lot of other new products coming out that um, don't use the same harsh chemicals as BeeGo, but also work as well. I've used Honey Bandit before. It doesn't work as well as BeeGo, but works just enough to do what you're looking to do. So there's definitely a lot of different chemicals on the market that can be used with these fume board methods. But basically, underneath the fume board, there's a cloth. You spray maybe a few squirts of spray at the bottom. The sun heats up this fume pad that produces a fume, and that pushes all the bees outside the super into the brood boxes. So it can be really fast, a fast method. It can be a really effective method, but you also don't want to use too much, because I always like to use the term like it kind of makes a bee stoned. If you use too much, the bees kind of get lethargic and unable to move. So you only want to use a kind of a few spritz on your fume board. Another method is a skateboard. So there's different types of skateboard. This is probably the most common one you can buy at any type of bee supply store. This one, I think this is a homemade one where they actually attach these conical tubes. So this is kind of an opening where the bees can basically move out of the big openings, but are unable to move back. But this is probably the most common type of skateboard that you can buy from any type of bee supply store. It's a one-way system, so that means once bees leave that board into the brood boxes, they're unable to come out. So what you typically do is you maybe when all the foragers come back, maybe in the middle of the day, you put this in between the brood boxes and the honey supers. You leave it on overnight, and so once the temperatures get really cold at night, all those bees are moving down from the supers into the brood boxes to take care of any of the young developing brood. And so what I mean, really major downfall of this is kind of more of a fall way of pulling honey. I've used in the middle of the summertime. It doesn't work as well because the temperatures at night don't get too cold, and so the bees aren't really moving down. So you want to use this mostly in the fall, probably September or October, but it can be really effective, and it's non-chemical, and you have to worry about burning your eyes. And so this can be a really good method if you want to try this out. But it might not work as well in July and August, especially if you do decide to pull honey during those time periods. Another method is a bee blower. I don't know why I didn't change this from a skateboard, but a bee blower. So basically, what you do is you pull out these honey supers. You can make some kind of modified stand to put the honey supers on. So when you're blowing it, the bees go right directly into the entrance, because you want to blow the bees to where the entrance is, because they can become disoriented. So you want to make sure they're as close to the box as possible. I've seen kind of a metal sheet here before where the bees can kind of slide down to the entrance. So there's different ways of doing it, but just a modified stand would work really well. You can use any type of bee blower, or any type of leaf blower. Those all work really well. And you basically blow out all the bees. You want to make sure you kind of move the frames around so it's easier to get the bees. Because sometimes if the frames are too close to each other, it's hard to push down the bees. Now this method, it's really fast and it can be kind of effective, but the problem is sometimes it's hard to get all the bees outside of the frames. And so if you have a lot of bees, it can be hard to push them outside the frames. So you'll probably always be bringing back bees. And so the cleanest methods are probably the skateboard method and the fume board method. But this can be really effective method too if you only have a bee blower or a leaf blower available. Okay, so after you kind of pull off your honey, the next step is actually extracting your honey. So the first thing to consider is really your moisture content. And so, moisture content typically isn't a major concern for small scale beekeepers. So really beekeepers that have less than 50 colonies. So I'd assume that the majority of beekeepers here have 10 colonies, but some may have more colonies. But, typically moisture content isn't the biggest concern. But here in Texas is something to really consider because in Texas, in certain parts, we have this high humidity, and when the humidity is really high, that can increase the moisture content in the honey. And one thing we're looking for inside the honey supers is a moisture content less than 18% if possible. But really less than 20% if that's possible. And so some areas it may be really hard to get that moisture content down. It doesn't really matter what you do. It's going to be almost nearly impossible. It also kind of depends on the honey source. So some honeys, depending on the sugar content in the honey, can have just a naturally higher water content. So for example, honey with higher fructose content tends to have more of those sort of a higher moisture content. And some honeys, the moisture content doesn't really matter. So some honeys are more likely to ferment, whereas some honeys aren't, depending on the sugar content and depending on what's actually in the honey. So it kind of depends on your specific type of honey sources your bees are collecting. Now, what you can do is you can actually, if you have a hot room, so some beekeepers might have the capacity to do that, you can make some sort of modified hot room. But what we're looking for is a room that's somewhere between 85 to 95 degrees with a humidity of somewhere between 0 to 20%. And by doing this and maybe having a fan that kind of blows over the honey supers, that's a really great way to remove moisture from your honey. And so it kind of depends on how high your moisture content is, but if it's 20%, and you do this for 24 hours, that can really decrease your moisture content. But really, the one thing to consider, especially here in Texas, is a small hive beetle. So you don't want to leave your honey sitting outside the colony for more than a couple days because a small hive beetle will get into your colonies. They will destroy your honey, will ferment your honey. So you want to be kind of cognizant of that. And so there's kind of a risk and benefit of removing your moisture content and ways to do that. This is kind of a commercial honey dryer. And so what it does is it basically thins out the honey and cycles it through the spinner and also heats it up and dries it and to really lower your moisture content. So with this method in this machine, you can lower your moisture content by, you know, a few percentage points within, a few hours. It's a really quick and easy way to do this. I know a lot of beekeepers don't have the money or don't want to invest into a product like this, which is totally fine. I've ran a few commercial operations with their honey houses, and we've never used this method before. Then again, we were in the Dakotas, and so the humidity was very high, and moisture content was never a concern for us. Dakotas, our humidity never gets really above 50%, and so our honey moisture content never gets above, 17, 18%. So it was really never a concern for us. But here in Texas, especially if you do decide producing large amounts of honey, you live in a high humidity area, you can make something like this. I've seen some beekeepers kind of make their own modified system where they kind of put honey into sort of a barrel, use sort of a mixing device to move the honey around, and then kind of blow over it with heat to kind of dry out the honey. It kind of depends on how big your barrel is and how much you're spinning that honey so all that honey has free access to that heat and that low humidity. But this can be one good method. Okay, so once you kind of consider your moisture content, so we'll talk about, how to use a refractometer and how to read your honey content. But the next step is really uncapping your honey. So when you're pulling off honey, what you want to do is when the honey is, like the term we use is ripened. So that means is the bees have processed that honey. they lower the moisture content and they capped it with these kind of white cappings. So this is what kind of capped honey looks like. And I'd assume that most of the beekeepers that are here have extracted honey before, so you know exactly what kind of white capped honey looks like. But before extracting honey, what you want to do is uncap that to allow that honey to kind of flow out and be extracted and eventually bottled. So there's different ways to basically uncap these wax cappings. So one major method is uncapping knife. So sometimes these are heated, sometimes they're not heated. I think the heated knives work really well, but if you want to use this a standard knife, you can also do that. You can buy these at really any bee supply store. You can buy these on Amazon, and they all work really well. But basically, what you do is you use this knife and you cut off the wax cappings to expose the honeys within the cells. And so I'm assuming that a lot of beekeepers have used or prefer to use the uncapping knife. Another method is in a capping fork. So I guess I'd personally prefer the knife if possible, but a uncapping fork works well too. It won't work as well as the capping knife. It might take a little bit longer, but what we do is you kind of scrape the wax, or you can kind of scrape at the wax to open it up. You might not be able to open up all the cells because this is more of a fork rather than a full knife, but it can be a really great way to kind of move the wax and cappings and expose the honey for extraction. Another method is kind of a roller uncapper. I've seen different methods where it's just kind of a single handheld device that has kind of knives that you roll over it. And so instead of hand scraping it, you can use a roller and roll over the wax and cappings. A lot of companies have started selling these kind of roller uncappers. So basically, what you do is you kind of these have these kind of sharp knives or forks. You push the frame through this, and it caps the cell. And as we talk about the commercial levels and their capping devices, they basically have an automated uncapper. So as the frames kind of move this machinery is moving the knives or the chains around to uncap the frames. But there are a lot of these kind of small scale devices, these roller uncappers that you can push the frame through and it'll do the uncapping for you. I've personally never used this type of roller uncapping before. I'd be curious to see how well it works. And so if any beekeepers in the chat have ever used one of these roller uncappers, let me know because I'm curious how well they actually work. Another method is on a capping plane. And so it's kind of similar to an a capping knife, but it's kind of more in this plane. So there's kind of a knife, heated knife underneath this kind of shield. You heat it up, so you plug it and heat it up, and then you kind of push over the frame, and that caps any of the wax and cappings from the honey. So there's definitely a lot of different ways you can kind of modify your own method. You can use this as kind of a standard knife. I think like kind of a heated knife or in a capping plane work the best. But I'm curious to see how well this roller and capper actually works. On the commercial level, they use these kind of industrial uncapping devices. And so for this one, for example, these frames kind of fit in here, they roll down, and then there's a knife that cuts out the uncappings. There's other devices where you lay the frame, face down. They go through the conveyor belt, and then there's a kind of a chain or knife that kind of rotates. And as the frame kind of moves through the knives and the chains kind of cut out the honey and the cappings and expose the honey for spinning and the actual extraction process. So, these devices can be pretty spendy. I mean, you can buy some for pretty reasonable, like a few $1,000s. But if you're a small scale beekeeper and only have a few colonies, probably a capping knife, a fork, a roller uncapper, uncapping plane are probably the best methods. But if you plan to ramp up to a small scale level, so having a few hundred colonies to even a commercial level where you have a few thousand colonies, I would highly recommend some kind of uncapping device because it's really the fastest and most effective and efficient way to remove any of those uncappings from the wax and the honey. So once you uncap the frames and the honey's all exposed, you need to put those frames into some sort of spinner, or I guess you can view it as sort of a giant centrifuge. So what happens is you put these frames into the centrifuge, it spins it really fast, and that spins the honey out of the cells. So as we talked about during the first and second lecture, the honey stored in these hexagonal cells. The way those cells are set up, it's a really great way to store and keep that honey inside those cells. And so you need a lot of force to actually pull out that honey in order to bottle it and also filter it. So there's different types of extractors and spinners. So, two frame extractors, a really great method if you only have 1 to 5 colonies. I guess I would recommend the handheld one versus the motorized one versus the handheld one. I've used a handheld one before and it does give you a good workout. If you are looking for a workout, then the handheld one works really well and you just spin it really fast. But if possible, I'd kind of buy a motorized one. You can buy some really cheap ones off Amazon and some B supply stores at, or maybe a few $100s, and they work really well. They may not last as long, but they are motorized and they can work well and kind of do the job what you're looking for. If you have somewhere between 5 and 20 colonies, I would recommend somewhere between a 4 and 8 frame extractor. Because if you're pulling off one or two honey supers, each one has 20 frames. So if you do 20 frames times five, that can be a few hundred frames. So if you're relying on just a standard 2 frame extractor, or maybe a 3 frame extractor, this can take a lot more time versus a 4 and 8 frame extractor. And so, you sort of have different methods. So you have the manual and electric, but electric is probably the most effective, and you have some really cheap options now. If you have somewhere between 20 and 50 colonies, you're getting into that mode of being of sideliner, producing large amounts of honey for wholesale. You might want to look into kind of a larger extractor, so maybe 9 to 20 frames, 24 frames. So kind of depending on what model they have. So this is a kind of a perfect kind of range for beekeepers that have somewhere between 20 and 50 hives. Now, I mean, it's really not to say that you can't use a 2 to 8 frame extractor. It just means it's going to take you a lot more time. And so it kind of depends on how much time you want to invest in the extraction process. If you want to invest a lot of time, then these smaller ones will work. But if possible, you might want to get to a larger extractor. You want you and so for the larger commercial beekeepers, they have more than 30 frame extractors, so 48 frames, even more than that at times. And so, if you have a commercial operation, you might want to look for some of these larger extraction systems. So there's kind of two different ways to kind of spin your honey. There's kind of the horizontal method where you're spinning in a horizontal way, so the frames are sitting upright and they're kind of spinning in a circular form. This is kind of a vertical extractor, like a vertical radial extractor where the frames are put in here and instead of going kind of horizontally in a motion, they're kind of going up and down in a vertical motion. So a lot of beekeepers have started using this kind of vertical method. I know Cowan, they make some really great products that kind of utilize this method. So, and one thing about this extractor specifically, they have a really great conveyor belt. So the frames are basically pushed through the encapper and then pushed directly into the radial spinner. And so it makes it really quick and efficient for a lot of beekeepers. Whereas this bottom method, you have to physically uncap all the frames and then move them over to kind of a radial spinner. So you basically have two steps for the bottom one, whereas you might only have one step for the top one. So it kind of depends on how large you want your honey extraction to be and how fishy you want your honey house to be. But if you're only doing this sort of as a hobby or even for small scale wholesale, some of these other methods will work just as well. Okay, so next you want to think about how to separate your honey from the wax. And so regardless if you're scraping off your wax, you're always gonna get a little bit of wax with that honey. And you can definitely sell it that way, but a lot of people and consumers are looking for honey that's clear and free of a lot of those kind of wax particles and other particles within the honey. And so there's different ways you can separate the wax from the honey. On a commercial level, they use these kind of commercial wax spinners. I've used this one before and it works really well. Basically, inside it's a sort of another centrifuge, and so you pour honey in the middle of this. It spins the honey really fast, and the wax gets kind of stuck on the walls, whereas the honey kind of falls through to the bottom. And it's actually a really great way to dry out the honey. So it from the wax, and so it's a really great way if you have a little bit of honey that's mixed with your wax to dry out the wax completely. It's also a really easy and effective way to render your wax because it dries out the wax completely. It allows you to melt that wax into kind of wax cubes or storing it for later. And so you basically put some kind of maybe a bucket at the bottom, some kind of catching device. So as the wax comes down, it goes down. This is kind of a spinner, so you can move that blade in or out. And so as that wax builds up, you want to move that blade in to cut out that wax from the walls of the inside, and you can move it out again as that wax is cut off. And so that's kind of how some of these wax spinners work on a commercial level. These are really expensive. I think they're around 5 to maybe $10,000. They work really well, but I mean for a lot of small scale beekeepers, this may not be the most effective method. There's some of these uncapping tanks, so sometimes they're heated, sometimes they're not heated. The heated ones is kind of speed up the process, but there's kind of a filter in here. And so over time, as you put your honey into these uncapping tanks, the honey gets separated from the wax, and you're able to kind of separate that. And so, there's a certain type of mesh size here that's large enough for the honey to flow through, but not big enough for that wax to fall through. So it's a really great way to separate your wax. This can take a little bit more time, but for a lot of small scale beekeepers, especially if you have somewhere between 50 to 100 colonies, this can be a really great method. Then we have kind of a small scale uncapping tank. You can definitely use buckets. This uncapping tank allows you to pour more honey in here. This might be maybe 5 to 10 gallons. I'm not sure exactly how much it is, but there's a bucket right here. And at the bottom, there's kind of this sieve or this filter. So you pour your honey on here, and by using gravity, the honey flows through the mesh, whereas the wax stays on top. Now, with the uncapping tank and the small scale uncapping tank, you're not able to fully dry out the wax, and so you always have a little bit of honey inside your wax. There's not really a great way to do that unless you use one of these wax spinners. You can push it down a little bit, but you're always going to be losing a little bit of honey during these two steps. For a lot of small scale beekeepers, that doesn't matter too much. You may lose a little bit of honey, but overall, you're getting more than enough for what you're using it for and what you're selling it for. So once you separate the cappings from the honey, you can use some kind of warming tank to heat up the honey and improve the heat exchange so that the honey flows harder and it's able to pass through this mesh faster versus other methods. And so this can be a really great method. Some of these tanks can be pretty relatively cheap. I think this one's maybe a few $1,000s, but you can buy some cheaper options. This kind of hot water. Oh, my apologies. This is I'll go back here quick. I don't know what happened here. This kind of connects to the hot water, so the hot water flows through here that heats up the honey to a level that's not damaging to the enzymes and particles within the honey, but also allows the honey to flow through that mesh, but keep that wax separated from the mesh. So it's really a great way for warming the honey and filtering the honey to have less particles, less debris, and less wax in the honey when you're actually bottling the honey. So typically the honey is warmed to a degree around 95 to 110 degree Fahrenheit. And we'll talk about why this number is important, but it's high enough to increase the viscosity of the honey so it flows easier, but not hot enough where it destroys any of the important nutrients or enzymes within the honey. What's really great about this, it's really controlled temperature. So, if you're heating this on your stove top, for example, it's really hard to control the exact temperature, whereas this has really precise temperature control. It also has a circulation device to heat up your honey. So it's really a great method. But yeah, if you're using direct heat, so this uses kind of hot water that flows through the system, and so you're not using direct heat. You're using sort of this heat exchange where the heat exchange between kind of that pool of water in these pipes into the honey. Whereas if you use kind of direct heat, like on a stovetop, for example, this is where you start kind of the open flames. You may scorch your honey, cause issues with the honey, but it's also harder to control the temperature. But really for a lot of small scale beekeepers, you can use a standard sieve. So kind of centrifuging the honey, spinning the honey out, and then you basically pour the honey onto these sieves. These sieves come in different kind of filtering size. So it depends on how hard you want to filter the honey. Is there a hand up? Heather said. I think it's uh Doug. Douglas Wingate.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Hello? Okay. Yeah, I've used the roller on Capper. We have a little co-op that gets together and extracts, and we don't get the pile of cappings at the end. It makes it nice because when you're doing a group of like 10 people extracting together, everybody takes their own cappings home, and the bees clean up all the waste, clean up all the frames. It basically just cuts the surface. You might not get as much honey, but it makes for a cleaner process because you don't end up with, you know, 40, 50 pounds of cappings.
Do you use this exact roller and capper or just kind of a handheld one?
It fits on top of a bucket, and you only slide one frame in at a time,
Okay.
and you have to lower the frame in from the top, but you have to kind of push it laterally forward and towards you to make sure it uncaps them all.
Okay. Yeah, yeah. I'd imagine this is a really great method for the small scale beekeepers. Yeah, and like you said, you're not getting as many cappings. You may be losing a little bit of honey, but for what you guys are using it for, that seems like a perfect option. Chris, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I was just going to say, Hilco has one that they just came out with recently in the last few months. As a matter of fact, I don't think they're shipping it until the end of this month. That is a pretty reasonably priced heated rolling uncapper.
Do you have a link for that? Is that on their website?
Yeah, I'll put it in chat here.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I think this could be really effective. Yeah, especially if it's heated and I mean I'm not sure whether or not it needs to be motorized or not, but I think this would be a really great method for especially small scale beekeepers. And kind of like what Douglas said, it won't be as messy. You might lose a little bit of honey, but it can be a really great method to use. Yeah, and so a lot of beekeepers can use these different sieves, and so these come in different mesh sizes, and so some are finer versus kind of larger mesh sizes. So it just depends on the extent you want to filter your honey. So if you don't want any particles, you want to increase your clarity of your honey, you can use a really finer mesh, but no, the finer the mesh, the harder and the longer it's going to take to get that honey to filter through that mesh and separate any wax and particles from the actual honey. And so you might want to heat your honey a little bit. I wouldn't use any direct heat if possible. It's just going to ruin your honey and it's just hard to control the temperatures. But if you want to heat up your honey a little bit to some extent, I think they have kind of 5 gallon pails with kind of heat devices that kind of wrap around them. They can heat up to your honey to some extent to increase the increase the flow, and allow the honey to pass through these filters faster. And so both these methods can be really effective depending on how much honey you plan on extracting. So heating up wax, right? So one thing you always want to consider is you don't want to use direct heat. And so you can use one of these stovetop methods, if you do have some extra wax capping. So once you separate the honey from the wax, maybe you want to render that wax and use it for maybe a honey show, or you want to sell it either wholesale or give it away to your neighbors. You want to think about how you want to kind of heat up that wax and process it and render it in a positive way. And so these double boilers work really well because you're not putting the wax on direct heat, you're putting on indirect heat. So the process is you're basically heating up this honey. This heat from the boiling water is transferred to the wax and allows that to heat the wax and melt in a way that doesn't actually burn the wax. Now you definitely never want to kind of heat up wax directly in some sort of pail or some sort of pan directly on heat because it will burn the wax and cause some issues. Same thing with honey. So if you do want to heat up your honey for some reason, I probably wouldn't recommend using a stovetop, but you can definitely do that if you want, especially if you can control the temperature to some extent. Um, but you never want to put honey on direct heat. So you want to use some kind of double boiling device similar to this. And then once you kind of heat the wax and it melts, you can pour it over kind of a paper towel, kind of a sieve lined paper towel or some kind of mesh to separate any of the debris or the dirty types of wax or the really debris that's within the wax from the purified wax, and you pour it directly into a mold or a candle or whatever you plan on using it for. So, if you're only kind of producing a small amount of wax you want to heat up and put into either a candle or put into some kind of mold, this could be a really great method. A lot of beekeepers have started using the solar method, and so instead of relying on heat from a stove, you can rely on the sun to heat up the wax, melt the wax, and purify it in a way that you can use into candles or other types of products. And so this is just one type of device. I know there's a lot of solar wax melting devices online. You can make your own if you want to. There's definitely a lot of available resources online. But you basically put the wax in here, the heat basically heats up this device, and that allows you to kind of filter and render that wax in a higher quality way. There are some commercial wax melters. So similar to the kind of stovetop method, they use kind of this indirect heat method where there's hot water. This hot water transfers heat from the water onto the wax that melts the wax. So you don't have the indirect heat, and that allows you to kind of melt that wax, filter that wax, and render the whey that's as high quality as possible. So these, I believe these are probably about $3,000 off Man Lake. You probably won't be producing this much wax. Maybe Hilco and other companies have kind of smaller types of devices that you can purchase. But I think this is it's maybe 30 gallons. I forget. So if you can definitely put a lot of wax into these devices. You heat it up and then you can pour it off into any molds or any type of storage devices for your wax. So these are kind of two different types, but they kind of rely on that heat exchange from the hot water. Okay, next step is bottling honey. So the ideal temperature for bottled honey is around 95 to 105 degrees. Now, that's not saying that you can do without heating up the honey. It just makes it easier to kind of filter the wax from the honey and then eventually bottle it that way. It also makes the bottling process a lot faster if you heat it up just a little bit. You definitely don't want to heat. Yeah, so we'll talk about wax a little bit. One of the problems with raw honey is there can be a lot of different types of yeast in the wax, and that can lead to fermentation, especially if you have a higher water content and you're not storing the honey and bottling the honey properly. And so if you are worried about fermentation, especially if you do have a high water content, you may want to heat up the honey to around 145 degrees for 30 minutes to kill any yeast in the honey. And so if your honey has a really high moisture content and you tried everything you can do to remove that moisture content, but still really high, and you're concerned for some reason or the other. And like I mentioned, some honey sources just have higher water content in general. Um, and they typically don't have any issues. But if you do know you have a honey source that is more likely to ferment, it does contain a lot of yeast. You may want to heat it up to 145 degrees to kill any yeast. Now you can pour the honey directly into a bottle this way. So if you only have a few colonies and you plan on bottling just a few, maybe a few hundred, this could be a really great method for doing it. You can buy any special devices. So that's sort of what's sweet about just pouring it directly from maybe a 5-gallon pail into one of these bottles. You can get one of the commercial bottling tanks. So it's very similar to the wax tank. We keep doing that. The wax tank where you have kind of hot water flowing through this hot water exchanges heat to the honey, and that allows you to kind of heat up the honey to that right temperature. There are these different bottling devices that there's a scale, and so it fills up that jar into that certain weight, and then once it's done, it stops bottling it. And so it's a really effective way to kind of move the honey in and out. So there's different ways to bottle your honey. I'm sure some of you have done that already. Okay, honey enzymes. So the one thing to consider with your honey are the enzymes within honey. So honey has really three major types of enzymes, and these enzymes have important functions for not only the quality, the flavor of the honey, but also the longevity of this honey. Now, the three major enzymes within honey are invertase, glucose oxidase, and diastase. Now, invertase is, well, I'll sort of go back. So if you have honey, for example, and you pour water into it, the natural process having water will degrade these complex sugars into simple sugars. And that's what sort of gives the honey its sweetness is the glucose and fructose. But one way to speed up that process is honeybees actually add these enzymes called invertase that converts sucrose into glucose and fructose. And this would makes honey naturally sweet. Now, if you've ever had like high fructose corn syrup, you know how sweet it is. And so this fructose can make honey these different types of flavors. But even sucrose is sweet to some extent, but it's different once it's converted to this glucose and fructose. But basically, invertase is the enzyme. It speeds up that process and allows the conversion of sucrose into fructose and glucose, which are the primary sugars within honey. Another enzyme is called glucose oxidase. What this enzyme does is it converts glucose, which is a simple sugar syrup, into both gluconic acid and hydrogen peroxide. Now, hydrogen peroxide is what really gives honey its antibacterial properties. And so, I think we've all used hydrogen peroxide before in cleaning and desanitization or sanitizing our specific areas. And so, honeybees, what they do is they produce this enzyme that produces the, hydrogen peroxide within the honey, and that gives it a lot of these antibacterial properties. And the third type of enzyme is diastase. And so it breaks down starches into simple sugars like glucose and fructose. So a starch is basically a complex sugar. So like bread, for example, is an example of starch. Potatoes are example of starches. These are complex sugars. And so invertase alone won't break down these starches into simple sugars. So they add diastase to break down these starches into simple sugars like glucose and fructose. Now, with all of these, just know that the activity will change as the honey is heated. So if you heat up your honey, these proteins are more likely to degrade or maybe lose their activity. And so if you're heating honey to a high temperature, you can degrade a lot of these really important enzymes, and that can ruin some of the function of them within the honey. So, for example, if you're degrading invertase, this could change the conversion of sucrose into glucose or fructose. If you're changing glucose oxidase, you may have less hydrogen peroxide production inside the honey, which is really what's has antibacterial properties and preserving that honey for a long period of time. And so, heating up the honey can be really important for your filtering and the flow through your system, but can be really detrimental to the quality of your honey. So boiling honey, this kind of talks about the temperatures that can degrade some of these enzymes. So if you're heating your honey to above 120 degrees Fahrenheit, this can start the degradation of your enzymes. So that's one reason I recommended, less than 120 degrees if possible. I think it said like 105. Yeah, like 95 to 105. That's enough to, make the honey a bit more fluid, but also not degrade any of the important enzymes within honey. So once you get to around 140 to 160 degrees, the invertase, which is the enzymes that break sucrose into glucose and fructose, starts to degrade. Once you get to 160 degrees, this breaks down glucose oxidase, which is really important for producing that hydrogen peroxide. So glucose oxidase is more tolerant to the heat, but once you get to the higher temperatures, it can start degrading this enzyme. But yeah, once you get into the yeast section, the fermentation section, just know that if you want to degrade your yeast, you may have to heat up your honey to 145 degrees for 30 minutes. But if you want to preserve these enzymes to some extent, you can heat your honey at lower degrees for longer periods of time to degrade any yeast within your honey. So we'll talk about temperatures you can use and how you can target the yeast and degrade the yeast so you don't lead to any fermentation, especially if your water moisture content is really high in your honey. So this is what a commercial honey house typically looks like. Each one's a little different. So I got this straight out of the Hive and Honeybee. It's a really great book and resource published out of Daydent. And so I do highly recommend this book. It's 1,000 pages. So, it's really hard to read the entire book, but it's a lot of really great information that you can refer to. So a beekeeper, typically they bring in their honey supers. They typically put them in these hot rooms to control the humidity, lower the temperature, and potentially lower the water content for the actual extraction process. They put the honey supers to the cappers. The cappers take off any of the wax cappings on top of the honey. So typically they're knives or their chains, and then caps the honey. These then cappings go into sort of a wax spinner, and this wax spinner separates any of the wax from the honey, and it basically dries out that wax so it can be used for processing, but it also allows a beekeeper to not lose as much honey and maintain as much honey as possible. The honey then kind of flows back into the sump pump and goes through the entire system. But after the capping machine, beekeepers kind of a few different options. So this is kind of this is a really old method. This was historically used. These kind of 48 frame kind of horizontal spinners. So you basically take the frames, put them in here individually, and spin them for around somewhere between 20 to 30 minutes, and that'll kind of push out all the wax or basically all the honey from the frames. Now in North Dakota, we use steamer. So we actually steam the frames to get as much honey as possible. But in North Dakota, where we had a lower water content for all of our honey. Water and moisture content was never a concern for us. And our humidity was so low in North Dakota that we never had to deal with any type of moisture issues within our honey. So we could actually, add moisture to the honey to make it easier to remove any of that honey residue and get as much honey as possible. We didn't apply a lot of water, right? We were just steaming the honey, but it allows us to dry out those frames as much as possible. Now, in my opinion, I don't think steaming the honey was really necessary. It's always good to have a little bit of honey left on your frames because the bees are more willing to accept that and clean it out. But that's just what my bosses use, and that's what a lot of beekeepers in the Dakotas at least used. After honey flows out, it goes into this kind of holding tank and is pumped through the entire system. So typically it goes to a system where the honey's heated. So some beekeepers have started using kind of heated pipes. And so as the honey kind of flows through these pipes, it's heated to an exact temperature. We actually used kind of heated plates. And so what we did was we thinned out the honey and moved it over these plates and flowed kind of through the system. And so that basically decreased the surface area or increase the surface area of the honey. We were able to heat it up and lower the moisture content that way, especially since we were adding steam to our frames. After that, it went into kind of these holding tanks. And in these holding tanks, naturally, any extra particles or wax flows up on top, or any foam flows up on the top, whereas the honey's on the bottom. And so you're basically, either filling up barrels or filling up directly into bottles on the bottom of that part. Now I will say that once you go through this entire system, like heating and going through this wax and capper, there's not a lot of debris, but you can still get a lot. You can still get a little debris left in your honey. Maybe some bee particles like their legs or their heads, for example. But by placing in these kind of holding tanks is a great way to separate those. Then after that, you kind of bottle it or you put into a barrel and then you sell it, whether you're selling a wholesale or selling it in bulk. This is kind of the general lay of the land for a lot of beekeepers. Now, a lot of beekeepers have started to try to increase the efficiency of this process. So, one, try to get as much honey as possible, but also kind of remove as many steps as possible. So, a lot of these steps are kind of all included in one. So, the capper flows right into the extractor, the honey spinner, right into these bottling tanks. So, basically, what you do is you put a honey super right on here. There's a hydraulic device that pushes up all those frames, and you push these frames through a conveyor belt. And as the conveyor belt goes to the capping, it caps the honey and it flows directly into the extractors. You spin it for about 20 minutes and then then it flows through the conveyor belt directly back into the boxes. So you instead of having maybe 3 to 4 steps, you basically have one step involved. And so beekeepers have started making these processes more efficient. And a lot of these commercial extraction systems like Cowan have developed a really efficient system for a lot of beekeepers. Okay, next is a kind of honey processing considerations. So when you're processing honey, like what are some things you should think about and what are some things you should consider? So the first thing you should always consider, especially here in Texas, is moisture content. And so being from the Midwest, we never had to deal with or worry about moisture content. It was never a big issue, but we also don't have, high humid areas. And so, once they started keeping bees in Indiana or even in Texas, moisture content became a bigger concern. And it kind of depends on your specific part of Texas. So if you're kind of in the Houston area, the Gulf Coast region, it's gonna be more humid and you're gonna have more moisture content issues. Whereas maybe you're in the Panhandle, for example, moisture might not be as big of an issue. So a lot of times the moisture content, it depends on your specific part of Texas. Another consideration is your storage temperature. So how are you storing your honey? Because if you store your honey in a certain way, that can lead to toxic chemicals in your honey like HMF. It can lead to more fermentation in your honey. It can lead to a lot of other quality and flavor issues in your honey. And so storage temperature can be a really big challenge, especially if you don't plan on bottling and storing that honey in a kind of a cool, dark place. And then the final consideration is fermentation. I think we all love fermentation, right? When it comes to mead and making honey wine, and so it's a really important process. And you don't actually have to add your own yeast if you don't want to. Honey naturally has its own yeast, but you can if you want to. But it's no, like I said, that honey has a lot of its own yeast, and so if you one have a higher moisture content, but two not degrading in those yeasts in your honey, you can have some fermentation issues that can ruin your entire batch of honey. So fermentation can be a really important consideration when kind of extracting and bottling your honey. Okay, so have any of you made mead before? Maybe some of you have played around with it, made mead. I'm assuming a lot of you have tried mead before. So VK says yes, you tried it. Lee says he's tried it. Yeah, so it's really fun. It's really fun to make your own mead and wine, and compared to beer making, it's really easy. Beer making can be really tedious and time consuming and need special devices, especially if you want to make beer a certain way and use a different variety of beer. But mead making is a pretty simple process and something that people have been doing for a long time. But just remember that, honey has a lot of its natural yeast in it. And so if your moisture content is really high and your temperature is really high, you can lead to more fermentation of your honey that can degrade your quality and your flavor of your honey, and it can ruin really an entire batch of honey. So fermentation is something you should consider. So the first thing to look at is your moisture content with your honey. So this is a refractometer. It allows you to put honey on the device, look through the scale, and see sort of what your water content is. There can be some kind of variability in this. You want to try to buy a more sort of a higher quality one if possible to get more accurate measurement as possible, especially in an area where water content and moisture content is a bigger concern. But this can give you kind of a rough idea about what your moisture content is. And like I mentioned, some honey sources and moisture content aren't that big of a concern, but for some honey sources they are. And so you might have to kind of dry your honey a little bit to remove any of that moisture. So it's really important to know what your moisture content is before you start bottling your honey, because the worst case scenario is to having your honey ferment, ruin its flavor and its moisture, and causing issue with your honey, especially you are selling a wholesale to a farmer's market or to your friends and family. So a moisture content between 16 to 18% is preferred to prevent any type of fermentation and also maintain the quality of the honey. So this is kind of the range you're looking for. Like I said, in the Midwest, our moisture content was really never above 16%, maybe around 17, maybe into 18%, but we never ever had honey moisture above 20%. So that was a really great thing about keeping bees in the Midwest. But here in Texas, like I mentioned, we have, higher humidity, and that can lead to increased moisture into your honey. And so you want to make sure your moisture content is hopefully between 16 and 18%. But like I said, variations matter. And so depending on the type of honey and the sugars within the honey, that can increase or decrease the moisture within the honey, especially from the outside environment where the humidity is really high. So in general, fructose is more hygroscopic. And so if your honey has a higher fructose content, these honeys are more likely to absorb and increase the moisture content in your honey. And so this is what I was saying about the variety of honey in which your bees are bringing in really matter, because if your honey has a higher fructose content and you're a high humidity area, your honey is more likely to absorb some of that moisture from the area and store it within the honey, and that's going to increase your moisture content. And so in these situations, especially if your honey does have a high fructose content, you might want to have a hot room or have some way of drying out your honey to get to that optimal 16 to 18%, especially if you plan on storing that honey for longer periods of time. So, like I said, fructose is more hygroscopic. So that means it absorbs and retains more moisture from the air. Glucose crystallizes more quickly and it holds less water. So, crystallization is something that all beekeepers have to deal with. So your honey's probably going to crystallize with a higher glucose content, but the less glucose content, the more likely your honey is to absorb more moisture from the air. So these are kind of some examples of high fructose honey. So Tupelo honey, black locust honey tends to absorb more moisture and retain more moisture than some other honey sources, like canola and clover. These tend to have less moisture content, but also crystallize more quickly because it has, more glucose in it. And this is one reason that, glucose or clover is sweeter and kind of lighter color, because it has a higher glucose content. So hygroscopicity is really important to consider with honey. And so honey is, really likes to absorb a lot of honey, a lot of water from the air. So honey is basically a bunch of sugars in one. And because the honey already has a lower moisture content, the flow of water flows from a high concentration area to a low concentration area. So if your concentration, your humidity is really high outside and your moisture within your honey is low, that moisture from the air will flow right into your honey, increase your moisture content. And so if honey can absorb water if exposed to high humidity. So if you're in an area where the humidity can be, 60 to 100%, your honey is more likely to absorb and retain some of that honey and increase the moisture content with your honey. So that's why if you are bottling honey and your honey water content is really low, you want to make sure that your honey is properly stored in an airtight container to prevent the honey from becoming too liquid, from absorbing some of that water, to retain that moisture, and eventually fermenting. And so this is something to really consider, especially if you're in a high humidity area. So this kind of looks at sort of a general chart about like relative humidity and how that relates to water content. Like I said, not all honey is created the same. Not all nectar is created the same. So it kind of depends on your honey sources. But this is This is what it looks like for a standard kind of white clover wildflower honey. So I think this stand was made from a mixture of alfalfa honey and clover honey. But the humidity is outside, the water content will be around 15 to 15.9%. So in the Dakotas, our humidity never really got above 50%. And so our water content was really right around this 15 to 60%. And so because the humidity was so low outside, we had less likely to have a lower water content. But as you can see, as the humidity outside gets higher and higher and higher, then the water content also gets higher. So if you're getting to humidity where it's constantly 65 to 70 um, um, relative humidity outside, your water content could be at or even above 20%. Now, bees are really great about lowering the water content to the best of their ability, but even if bees are removing some of that moisture content to store that honey, your humidity could be really high outside, and that can allow the honey to retain a lot of water. And so you kind of want to look at your relative humidity for about the month of July, whenever your bees are starting to bring in nectar, to kind of get an idea what your moisture content is. You can also kind of pull off honey and use a refractometer to measure your moisture content, but just know that the higher humidity, the higher the water content. So, air warmed at 95 degrees can reduce moisture content by 1 to 3% after 24 hours. So, if you do have a hot room and you're able to not only heat up that hot room to at least 95 degrees, but also decrease the humidity from somewhere between 0 to 20%, that's the best and fastest way to remove any moisture content. Now, here, especially here in Texas, you're kind of on a timeline, because if you leave honey sit in a room or even a hot room for too long, the small hive beetle will move in. They'll destroy your honey and ferment your honey. And so you want to try to decrease your moisture content as soon as possible, ideally within, 1 day to 24 hours. So if you're able to make kind of a makeshift hot room, heat it to 95 degrees, make sure use a dehumidifier to decrease the humidity to 0 to 20%. That's the fastest, most effective way to decrease the moisture content with your honey. Um, but yeah, it kind of depends on how much honey you're producing. Like I mentioned earlier on, if you're a small scale beekeeper, moisture content probably isn't that big of a concern. But if you plan on selling this wholesale and you want the highest quality honey as possible, you want to make sure that moisture content is low. But you also want to make sure you can store that honey for longer periods of time without it lowering quality and leading to fermentation. So I talked about kind of a commercial honey dryer. Like I said, this is probably unnecessary for most beekeepers. I personally never used a honey dryer, but then again, I've managed a lot of bees in the Midwest. So we never had to deal with moisture content. But if you're in an area that has a high moisture content and you want to make sure your honey is at a specific moisture content, specific quality every time you bottle and sell that honey, you might want to think about a honey dryer. And you can modify your own systems. I've seen people modify these systems before where they put into a barrel, they spin the honey around, and then kind of blow hot air over the barrel. Now, you really want to cycle that honey the best of your ability to get all the honey within that barrel. But yeah, if you're using a 5-gallon pail, you should be able to spin that honey enough, blow air over all the honey, and decrease the moisture content to the best of your ability. So there's some modifications you can make and potentially make your own honey dryer. This was a makeshift hot room that a beekeeper made. This is kind of a tent in here. They're able to have a small heater in here to heat it up to 95 degrees, but while also adding a dehumidifier to make the humidity somewhere between 0 to 20%. And by putting it here for maybe around 24 hours, you're able to decrease your moisture content by somewhere between 1 to 3%. So if you're right at that 20%, within 24 hours, you could decrease your moisture content by 3% to that 17%. So this can be a really great way to decrease your moisture content. Now, some beekeepers have different types of hot rooms, more commercial hot rooms, but there's definitely different ways you can make your own modified hot room for your operation. So one thing to consider with honey and decreasing the moisture content of honey is you want to increase the surface area. So honey is naturally stored in these hexagonal cells. And so by storing these hexagonal cells and be stored compactly inside those cells, that decreases that decreases the surface area. And by decreasing the surface area, that honey is more likely to retain and keep that moisture within the honey. So one way you can get around that and decrease the moisture content in a quicker way, especially if you already extracted your honey and you barrel it and you're like, oh shoot, my water content is, or my moisture content is 20%. I need to decrease its moisture content as fast as possible. One thing you can do is increase that surface area of the honey apply kind of warm air over the honey, and that'll decrease the moisture content extremely fast. So one thing that we always used in the Dakotas was these kind of warming trays. So the honey would be pumped out of the extractor and then go into these heated trays about 110 degrees. And by heating over those trays, that increases the surface area of the honey, sort of like this, and we blew warm air on that decreased the moisture content really quick. And so, they would be on these trays for maybe a minute or so, maybe a minute to 3 minutes, and that was enough to lower the moisture content to 15 to 16%. And so this could be one thing you could consider. You can gently heat the honey, but remember, if you're lowering the surface area by storing honey in a 5-gallon pail, a 1-gallon pail, or even an entire barrel, that you're decreasing the surface area. So it's gonna be harder to remove the honey after storing in that way. And so you might want to kind of mix the honey and then apply warm heat over it for 24 hours. You can't just simply put a heater into the honey. That's not going to be a good way to remove the moisture content. You need to kind of blow the air off the honey. So you might want to gently heat the honey, mix it a little bit, and then apply warm air over it. But yeah, constant airflow can be a really good way to not only circulate the honey, but remove any moisture. Okay, storage honey. So high temperatures can break down honey's natural sugars, and what happens is it can lead to this thing we call like a Maillard's reaction. So Maillard reaction means that heat is interacting with the sugar that's causing it to caramelize and turn the honey dark and black. And so I think a lot of beekeepers have maybe stored honey into a storage shed when it's not temperature controlled, it's not a room temperature, and you come back even 24 hours later or even weeks later, and the honey starts turning this blackish, darkish color. Sometimes you might see kind of shades of these different colors where the top is black and the bottom is still crystallized, that clear color we're looking for. So it's kind of in that Miller's reaction. But if you're storing honey in an area that's above 104 degrees, especially for multiple days, even multiple weeks, your honey can start turning black and this darkish color and really begin caramelizing. Now, this is something that's really undesirable by consumers. So if you do plan on selling honey or give away to your neighbors or your friends, this is something that doesn't taste as good as the honey that's extracted and raw directly from the colony. And so you want to try to prevent this Maillard reaction as much as possible. So, storing this at room temperature is ideal. Storing at colder temperatures can be also ideal, but you don't want to store your honey when it's above 104 degrees, especially for multiple days to multiple weeks. But yeah, if honey has a high moisture content, so it's above 18%, even 20%, and exposed to heat, it can also ferment. And so, if you're storing honey, for example, and you typically see this Maillard reaction when your water content's really low, but let's say in a situation where your water content's maybe around 20%, and you're storing in an area that's 104 degrees, you didn't heat your honey properly, so you have a lot of yeast in your honey. This can lead to fermentation, off-colored, off-flavored, and even sour smell to your honey. So storage temperature can be really important, especially if you plan on storing that honey for multiple weeks to even multiple years. One thing to consider also is HMF development, hydromethyl furfural. So this is a really toxic chemical that can be produced in honey. What happens inside your honey, if your honey is heated or is more acidic, that can lead to more of this HMS development. And so if you feed this directly onto your bees or your colonies, this can lead your bees to get that toxicity and eventually die. Now, there's definitely no toxicity to humans, and so I do know some beekeepers may store their honey in a shed, for example. It may lead to HMF, but HMF is not going to be toxic for human consumption. But it can be toxic to the honeybees. So if you do plan on feeding honey back to your bees, which I do not recommend, but if you plan on doing that anyways, you want to consider this HMF, especially if honey was stored in the shed for multiple weeks or even months. Now, there is a legal limit to sell your honey with HMF. So it's about 40 milligrams per kilogram. So if your honey has more than that of HMF inside your honey, you cannot legally sell that in the United States. Now, people aren't testing for this. And so, I mean, even if you have HMF, they're not testing for it. But just know that I guess we don't have any human concerns to it because it's not toxic to humans, but there are some legal limits to how much can be in your honey, I should say. So what increases HMF? So one is heat. So if you're storing honey at 104 degrees for a long period of time, that can lead to HMF. But also if you increase the acidity of your your sugar syrup or your honey, that can increase HMF. So I know there's a huge trend for beekeepers adding vinegar or citric acid to their sugar mixture, but just know when you make your sugar syrup more acidic, that can lead to more of this HMF. And so if you are adding vinegar or citric acid to lower your pH of your sugar, then you want to make sure you apply that to your honeys and feed it to your bees as soon as possible. So this is kind of temperature range for HMF. So what we're really looking for is this middle line. This is the middle line where it's toxic to honeybees. And so what we look at is a simple one-to-one solution, and we store these for different days at different temperatures. So as you can see, if you're storing that sugar solution at 20 degrees Celsius, that honey will not develop a toxic HMF until around 750 days. So you have a long time, maybe multiple years before that develops HMF to a level that's really toxic to your bees. But as you can see, as you increase temperature, the days of storage really decrease. So for example, if you're storing your honey at 95 degrees, so this is 95 degrees right here, it only takes about 50 days for that honey or that sugar to develop HMF to a level that's toxic to your honeybees. But if it's about 104 degrees, for example, you only have maybe 10 to 20 days before it develops a really toxic HMF level. So these are things to really consider. So these are kind of general guidelines. So this is a kind of toxic level in honey that's toxic to bees. So if you're storing, honey at 30 degrees, it won't develop a toxic level till around a year or 250 days. But if you're storing honey to 50 degrees, it'll develop HMF at toxic level around 10 days, and then less than 10 days for 70 degrees. So these are all things to consider. So if you do have some honey that's been stored in the shed for a couple of years and you think about using it, I would probably not use it. We do have really warm temperatures here in Texas. It gets above 90 degrees for 9 months out of the year. So remember, if you are mixed up sugar and it's been stored in your shed for a long period of time, especially if that's not a temperature controlled shed, it can have HMF. And if you feed that directly onto your bees, it can kill your bees and your entire colony. Okay, so next thing, the final thing to really consider is fermentation. So what impacts the fermentation of the honey? So the first thing is the moisture content. So moisture content, if it's a higher moisture content and there's more, yeast spores inside your honey, that can lead to fermentation, that can impact the color and the flavor of your honey. And this is something that, consumers don't want. They don't want fermented honey. Storage temperature can play a really big role in fermentation of your honey. So you want to make sure you store your honey or your bottles in kind of a dark, cool place. And then granulation. So if your honey granulates and then degranulates, or basically crystallizes and decrystallizes, that can increase the chance for that honey to actually ferment. Not only because it already has a higher sugar content or certain sugar content, but also because that increased activity of the yeast and causes more fermentation. So this is kind of the liability to ferment. So what moisture contents are more likely to ferment versus other ones? So if your moisture content is less than 17.1%, then your honey is pretty much safe and probably won't ferment even at an extremely high yeast count. And so even if you add yeast to that honey and it has a moisture content of less than 70%, so 15 to 70%, this honey is pretty unlikely to actually ferment. Now, if your moisture content is over between 17 to 18%, it's safe unless your yeast count is over 1,000 spores per gram. If your water content is 18, 90%, then you're safe unless it's about 10 spores per gram. 19, 20% safe unless there's only one spore per gram. And then if you're over 20%, you're always in danger of fermentation. Now, like I said, this is not all honeys treated the same. Each honey's a little bit differently. And so some honeys may not be in danger of fermentation, but this is just kind of general guidelines. So just know that if you have over 20% water content in your honey, has a really, really high chance of fermenting, and it's in this sort of danger zone. Now, I guess the question is, how do you know how many yeast spores are in your honey? It's tough to know unless you actually test for that. And so I kind of use these kind of general moisture content, and really you're safe between 17 to around 18%. So that's one reason I use that 17 to 8% for honey judging, or even knowing whether the honey's safe or not to ferment. Now, I get a lot of questions about how to heat your honey to not only degrade any yeast to prevent fermentation, but also make sure that the enzymes and the quality of honey stays intact. And so this gives you some general guidelines about how to heat your honey to not only degrade or remove any yeast spores, but also maintain the enzymes and important qualities of your honey. So first thing you want to do is you want to store your honey that's below 50 degrees Fahrenheit to prevent any fermentation. You can store it at higher temperatures, but around the 50 to room temperature is a really great way to prevent your honey from actually fermenting. And this is kind of more for your water content. So if you have a really high water content to your honey, so maybe around 20%, then you can still store your honey at 50 degrees Fahrenheit and you will have fermentation. But if your water content's I'd say 16 to 18%. The temperature doesn't really matter that much, and you won't have any fermentation because once again, you're not in that danger zone. But yeah, if you do plan on heating your honey, there's different ways you can heat your honey to um, pretty much kill off or remove any yeast inside your honey. So if you're heating your honey at 125 degrees, it takes about 470 hours to degrade and basically kill off any yeast within your honey. If you're heating up your honey at 135 degrees, it takes 60 minutes, 145 degrees at 30 minutes. And if you're heating your honey at 155 degrees, it only takes 1 minute to remove and kill any yeast inside your honey. So you want to sort of weigh not only degrading that yeast, especially if you have high water content in your honey, but you also don't want to degrade any of the important enzymes within your honey. So I typically recommend around 145 because that's a low enough temperature. Okay, I will say this is a high enough temperature that degrades and kills off any yeast within your honey, but it's a low enough temperature so you don't have any degradation from your enzymes within your honey. So I think 145 degrees for 30 minutes is a really great number to use. But you can definitely use a lower number. If you do plan on heating your honey for 470 hours, you can sure do that, but that will take a very, very long time. But if you do this, you're less likely to remove any of those important enzymes and remove any of the important qualities of your honey. But also, honey is more likely to ferment after granulation. So if your honey granulates just like this, and so some honeys are more likely to granulate versus other ones. But if your honey does granulate and does crystallize, but then for some reason you heat it up again, that honey's gonna be more likely to basically ferment. And so I guess it depends on how hot you heat your honey. So if you're microwaving this honey, for example, heating it above 145 degrees, you should be good for fermentation. But if your honey naturally crystallizes and then decrystallizes, this honey is more likely to ferment than other ones. So let's like touch on kind of other products of the other honey products. So I talked a lot about bottling honey and filtering the honey in a way that's desirable for the consumers. One type of honey that beekeepers commonly use is cream honey. I love cream honey. I think it tastes really good. But what you're basically doing is you're adding crystals to the honey. To this crystallized process, it produces these really fine crystals. And so these finer the crystals, the better the honey tastes. Now, if you've ever gone to a store, for example, and you tried different types of ice cream, so some ice cream, for example, is more expensive. It has a smoother flavor to it, and it just tastes a lot better. Versus if you buy the really cheap off-brand ice cream, it tastes really good, but you can kind of taste the differences between them. You can taste kind of the higher crystal content. You can see it's kind of chunkier than the more expensive brand, and the reason for that is the way that producers or manufacturers make the ice cream. And so the cheaper ice cream, the more off-brand ice cream, it it basically makes the ice cream in these larger crystals, and it doesn't have that smooth or that sweeter flavor to it. Whereas the more expensive ice cream, so maybe if you go to Cold Zone or some of these kind of higher end ice cream places, the ice cream just tastes a lot better. And the major reason for that is because it has a smaller crystal size. Now, for beekeepers, right, you have this natural crystallization process where your honey naturally granulates into these crystals. But by allowing your honey to naturally crystal, the crystals are going to be a little bit bigger, and the taste isn't going to be as good as rather than if you're controlling the crystal size. So during cream honey, what you do is you basically crystallize honey to a certain granular size, and that increases the flavor and the profile of the exact cream honey. So what beekeepers will do is they add kind of a starter set, so crystallized honey that already has specific crystal sizes. You put that into the honey, and it crystallizes your entire honey and creams your entire honey to a certain crystal size. and that gives your creamed honey that exact flavor. So if you ever want to try honey that's naturally crystallized or naturally granulates versus creamed honey, you can tell the differences. And the major difference is really the size of the crystals between the creamed honey and the honey that natural crystallizes or granulates. So typically beekeepers use a sort of a starter. You can make a giant starter, add that to your honey, and that allow your entire honey to become creamed and then eventually crystallize. I have seen beekeepers that have whipped honey before. I've seen some YouTube videos on it. I wouldn't recommend doing that, not only because it's not legal to sell that in the state of Texas, which I'll talk about in the next slide, unless you have the cottage law. But if you're just adding the starter crystals, then you should be fine to sell it just as a honey producer. So just know that if you're kind of hand whipping your honey and you still want to sell this honey wholesale or to a consumer, that you may have to fall into cottage law for that. Another product is comb honey. So I've done this before. I think it's a really fun process. You have these special devices that you can buy from Mann Lake. So either they have these kind of pre-filled cells inside of it. I guess these kind of maybe 3 inch by 3 inch open comb inside there. And so the bees build a natural comb, and then afterwards you're able to kind of pull that out and then put it into these plastic devices with these plastic storage containers and then sell it either wholesale or at a store. Or you can cut it out with one of these cutting devices. But yeah, Mann Lake sells a lot of these products, but I'd say a lot of these bee supply stores sell these. So has anybody ever made or sold comb honey? Lynn has? Okay. Do you sell it or you just do it for yourself?
Yeah, I do sell it. I sell both the pure raw creamed honey, and also I sell flavored, but I sell the pure raw under the Beekeeper Honey Producer. I don't use a mix or anything like that. I just stir it by hand. And for the flavored, I use the Cottage Food Laws for that.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. And I know Lynn, you were really really involved with that process. So if I'm messing up anything, I want you to correct me, please. So we'll talk about that during the second hour. Okay, perfect. Okay, so I think we'll take a 10-minute break before we get into the kind of laws and regulations here in Texas. And so let's come back at 10:25. And if you have any questions, we'll put those into the Q&A or into the chat. I'll try to answer as many as possible.